There is a certain kind of person who can sit in a crowded room and still feel like the only one truly awake. Not superior, not inferior, just different, as if they are watching a film that everyone else is inside of. And no matter how often they try to step through that screen, something pulls them back into the quiet, back into themselves, back into a kind of solitude the world has spent years insisting needs to be fixed. Message is not for everyone. If your schedule is always full, your group chats never pause, and your weekends are constantly occupied, this may not resonate the way it is intended to. But if you have ever held your phone, scrolled through your contacts, and felt absolutely nothing, not sadness, not desire, just a quiet awareness that no one there truly reaches you, then stay with this. Because what you are about to hear may be the first real explanation, you have ever encountered for something you have been silently carrying for years. Most people assume that having only a few friends means something went wrong. That at some point you failed a social test everyone else seemed to pass effortlessly. You were too sensitive, too intense, too much, or somehow not enough. The world gave you a ruler that measures friendships like achievements, and by that standard you always seem to fall short. And the hardest part was not the loneliness itself. The hardest part was the story you began to tell yourself about what that loneliness meant. But here is what people rarely say. There exists a specific psychological pattern, uncommon, precise, and deeply misunderstood, that often leads to having fewer friends, not because of failure or fear, but because of how a person is fundamentally wired to experience others. And once you understand that wiring, everything shifts. Not only how you interpret your social life, but how you understand yourself. Empaths experience the world on a level most people never reach. When someone enters a room carrying unspoken grief, the empath senses it before a single word is said. When a conversation moves from genuine to artificial, the empath detects the exact moment it changes. Not just mentally, but physically, like a shift in the air, figurative language. Studies in social neuroscience have repeatedly shown that highly sensitive individuals process emotional information more deeply, more completely, and across more regions of the brain than most people. They are not imagining their feelings. They are receiving more input than others around them. Now consider what that means socially. Every interaction, every conversation, every gathering, every relationship is more than just an exchange of words or time. For an empath, it becomes an immersive experience. You are not simply talking, you are absorbing emotional states, interpreting unspoken needs, balancing the energy of the space, and regulating your own inner responses all at once. And when it is over, you return home feeling drained in a way that rest alone cannot fully repair. This is the first misunderstanding about empaths with small social circles. People assume the limited circle reflects something lacking, a weakness in social ability, an unhealed wound, a fear of closeness disguised as choice. But when you step back, an entirely different picture appears. The smaller circle is not a lack of connection. It is the result of an exceptionally high standard for what real connection means. You have been part of conversations that felt like performances. You have maintained friendships where you had to filter yourself each time, softening the parts that were too honest, too deep, too direct, too much. You have smiled when expected, laughed on cue, shown up when required, and then driven home feeling lonelier than if you had stayed by yourself. And at some quiet point, without announcement, you stop, not dramatically, not through conflict or closure. You simply stop showing up because you finally realize something most people avoid their entire lives. The loneliness of being misunderstood among others is far heavier than the loneliness of being alone. That is not isolation, it is discernment, and the distinction between the two changes everything. Here is the contrast view explained clearly. Isolation is fear disguised as preference. It is withdrawal because the world feels unsafe, because vulnerability feels risky, because connection carries a cost you are unwilling to pay. Isolation diminishes you. It separates you from what you genuinely want. It is avoidance hidden in silence, and beneath it there is always a quiet ache. Discernment is something else entirely. Discernment is choosing with awareness, understanding who you are, what real connection requires of you, what you can give, and what you cannot. Discernment does not carry the same pain. It holds a sense of clarity, a quiet steadiness. You are not avoiding connection. You refuse to accept anything less than the real thing. And that refusal, sharp and unwavering, is exactly why an empath often ends up with a social world that is small, quiet, and deeply genuine. So the real question is not why empaths have so few friends. The real question is why we have spent so much time treating that outcome like a flaw instead of recognizing it as a signal, because signals carry meaning. And the meaning behind this one, once you learn to read it clearly, does not point to something damaged. It points to something rare, something most people spend their lives searching for in crowded spaces and never quite find. A relationship with their own inner world that is so complete, so truthful, so fully inhabited that external noise begins to feel like disruption rather than comfort. You are not someone who failed at friendship. You are someone who cannot pretend. And in a world built largely on social performance, that is not insignificant. It is not a weakness to fix. It is a compass, and what follows is about understanding exactly where that compass leads. Me in there is a moment most empaths can recognize even if they have never fully put it into words. It does not arrive suddenly. It unfolds slowly over years across different rooms through conversations that begin with promise and end in that familiar emptiness in your chest. The realization is simple. Being surrounded by people does not necessarily make you feel less alone. And once you see that truth, you cannot unsee it. It reshapes something fundamental. It changes how you move through social spaces, how you measure relationships, how you decide where your energy belongs and where it does not. Most people never reach this awareness because they never feel the contrast strongly enough. But for an empath, the contrast is unmistakable. It is the difference between breathing freely and breathing through a filter. And once you have felt that difference, you spend the rest of your life unwilling to return to anything less. Jen, this is where the story of an empath with few friends truly begins. Not in childhood shyness, not in rejection, not in some unresolved wound. It begins with perception, with the fact that empaths experience social reality at a depth and clarity most people simply do not access. Imagine it this way. Most people move through social interactions like someone walking through a dimly lit room. They can see enough to get by. They avoid obstacles. They leave without incident. But an empath steps into that same room with every light turned fully on. They see the furniture, yes, but also the dust on the shelves, the faint crack in the ceiling, the slight bend in the window frame, the ring left on the table that someone tried but failed to clean. They notice everything, and noticing everything is not always comforting. It is often exhausting. Domjas, because in a friendship, noticing everything means recognizing when words and energy do not align. When someone says they are fine, but their body tells a different story. When laughter comes a little too quickly, or silence lingers just a bit too long, or a cheerful tone carries something heavier underneath. You pick up on all of it, and once you do, you are never completely at rest in social situations. You are always observing, always interpreting, always tracking what lies beneath the surface. That level of constant awareness, that ongoing emotional effort, is something most people neither see nor understand, let alone return in equal measure. Jan, this is one of the most isolating parts of being an empath, and it is rarely spoken aloud. You offer others a depth of attention they may have never experienced before. You see them in ways that even their closest relationships often miss, and they feel it. That is why strangers open up to you so easily. That is why people you barely know share things they have never said out loud before. That is why your presence is often described as calming, grounding, or real. You create a space that is genuinely uncommon, but very few people are able to meet you there. Very few people will recognize the weight you are carrying in return. Very few people will notice your shifts the way you notice theirs. And over time, that imbalance, offering deep attention while receiving only surface level responses, becomes a weight that is difficult to keep carrying within relationships that are supposed to feel supportive. So gradually, you begin to let some of those connections fade, not out of anger, not through confrontation. You simply stop investing energy in places where nothing grows, and your circle becomes smaller. Yet the outside world looks at that smaller circle and draws the wrong conclusion. Chonjins. That conclusion usually sounds like this: that you are closed off, that you are difficult, that your standards are too high, that you expect too much while giving too little, or that deep down you are afraid of being truly known. And the most damaging part of that assumption is how easily you can start to believe it yourself. When the same narrative is reflected back to you repeatedly with consistency and confidence, you begin to question your own perspective. Maybe they are right. Maybe something is wrong. Maybe the one common factor in every fading friendship is you. Maybe you are too sensitive, too selective, too unwilling to meet people where they are. But that conclusion has it backward. Empaths do not end up with fewer friends because they refuse to meet people where they are. They end up with fewer friends because they have spent years doing exactly that, often at a significant personal cost, and eventually realize they cannot keep doing it without receiving anything close to the same depth in return. That is not being closed off, that is hard-earned wisdom. It is the kind of understanding that only comes from experiencing enough one-sided connections to finally recognize the pattern. And recognizing a pattern is not the same as giving up at night on people. It is choosing not to lose yourself within them. There is a particular clarity that emerges once you stop forcing connections that were never truly mutual. It is not the sharpness of bitterness. It is quieter, more grounded. It feels less like something ending and more like something clearing, as if a fog has lifted. Suddenly, you can see your own preferences, your own pace, your own needs without the interference of maintaining relationships that never quite fit. You begin to notice what genuinely restores you versus what only distracts you. You start to understand the difference between being alone and feeling lonely, and realize they are not the same thing, even though the world often treats them as identical. Gened for an empath, time alone is not emptiness. It is the opposite. It is where you process everything you have absorbed from your last interaction. It is where you return to your own natural state without adjusting, without monitoring, without carrying anyone else's emotional weight. It is not a fallback for failed connection. It is a real and necessary need, as essential as rest or nourishment. To treat it as something lesser, as proof of a problem, is like suggesting that the need for sleep is a flaw in character. The empaths who come to understand this stop apologizing for the size of their circle, not because connection stops mattering, but because they realize that the value of connection is not measured by quantity. A single relationship where you are fully seen, fully understood, fully accepted, without performance, without filtering, without shrinking, is worth more than 100 relationships built on a carefully managed version of yourself designed to keep others comfortable. That is the shift. And once it happens, everything that came before begins to make a different kind of sense. Mond, at the center of every empath's social experience, there is a question, rarely spoken, often not even fully conscious, but present in every fading friendship, every draining gathering, every relationship that ended not with conflict, but with a slow, quiet distance. The question is not, why do I have so few friends? That is only the surface. The deeper question is this: why does being truly known feel so rare when you invest so much effort in understanding others? That gap between how deeply you see people and how rarely that same depth is returned is the central tension in the empath's social world. Until it's recognized clearly, it is easy to misinterpret it as a personal flaw rather than what it really is: a mismatch between how you experience connection and how most of the world is structured to provide it. For many people, connection develops on a horizontal level. It grows through shared activities, shared routines, shared environments. You attend the same school, work in the same place, live in the same neighborhood. Over time, familiarity builds, and something that functions as closeness takes shape. It is real in its own way. It provides belonging, identity, a network of recognizable faces, but it is largely built from the outside in what you do together, where you go, what you appear to share on the surface. And for many, that is enough. For many people, that horizontal kind of connection defines friendship, what it is, how it feels, what it is supposed to be. But for an empath, that level alone is never enough. It never has been. Even as a child, before you had the words to explain it, simple proximity was not satisfying. You wanted to understand what people really thought beneath their surface. You were drawn to the conversation that began after the polished version ended. You wanted to sit with someone in their uncertainty, their doubts, their unanswered questions, not because you were attracted to struggle, but because that was where you felt something real. That was where connection stopped being a social exchange and became something genuine. Manja, you were always reaching for a different kind of connection, one that moved downward instead of outward, toward depth rather than across the surface. But the world is not structured for that kind of connection. It is built for the horizontal. Its social patterns, its small talk, its group settings, its constant streams of interaction, all of it is designed for breadth, not depth. It prioritizes impression over truth, comfort over honesty, ease over authenticity. And each time you tried to go deeper in spaces meant to stay shallow, you encountered the same invisible barrier. People would shift away, change the subject, laugh it off, or steer things somewhere safer. And you would feel that shift not just mentally, but physically, like a quiet door closing. Shaland, you would adjust, smile, and take note, another piece of understanding about how deep that particular person could go. And without conflict or announcement, you would begin to place them differently within your internal map of relationships. This is not coldness. It is not judgment. It is an empath learning through repeated experience who can hold emotional weight and who cannot, who can sit with honesty and who needs to avoid it, who shows up consistently in both comfort and discomfort, and who only exists within safe, controlled spaces. You are not ranking people, you are understanding them. And what you have come to see again and again is that true depth is rare. Not because people are inherently flawed, but because depth requires a level of courage and self-awareness that many have never been encouraged to develop. So, what happens when an empath keeps reaching for depth in a world that keeps offering surface? Usually, one of two paths emerges. Either they exhaust themselves trying to maintain surface level connection, showing up, fitting in, saying what is expected, sustaining relationships that feel restrictive and unnatural. Or they stop, they step back, they narrow their circle to those who have shown a genuine ability to meet them at depth, and they allow the rest to fade quietly. From the outside, that second choice is often misunderstood. It can look like withdrawal, like social failure, like someone who gave up or never fully tried, or even someone who feels superior and disengaged. But from the inside, it feels entirely different. It feels like relief. It feels like space. It feels like finally being able to breathe. This contrast is rarely acknowledged when people talk about empaths and friendship, the difference between how it appears and how it actually feels. Because from the outside, a smaller circle can look like something is missing, like something has been lost. But from within the experience, when you stop maintaining connections that quietly drain you, the picture changes completely. There is a sense of ease, there is openness, there is a kind of inner quiet that is difficult to explain to anyone who has never carried the weight of relationships that did not truly fit. And within that space, something meaningful begins to happen. You start to hear yourself again, not the filtered version, not the adjusted or carefully presented version shaped for others' comfort, but the real one. The one with thoughts that are more direct, insights that are more precise, emotions that run deeper than most conversations can hold. The version that has been waiting in the background while the outward-facing, self-handled social expectations. When that authentic self is finally given room, something shifts in how you relate to yourself. And that shift can be more fulfilling than many of the connections you once tried to maintain. This is the truth at the center of an empath's smaller circle, a truth that is rarely acknowledged openly. Being alone, when you genuinely understand yourself, is not a lesser experience than being surrounded by people who do not. It is simply a different experience. Quieter, yes. One that asks you to be comfortable with stillness, with your own thoughts, with the absence of distraction, but not an inferior one. For an empath, it is often within that quiet space that the most meaningful things take shape. Not the most visible, not the kind that translate easily into social narratives or outward validation, but the essential ones. The realizations about who you are, what you truly need, and what you are no longer willing to compromise just to belong. That kind of clarity only arrives when the noise drops low enough for you to finally hear what has been there all along. The empath's small circle is not a fallback for someone who failed to build something larger. It is a chosen space, created by someone who has learned to tell the difference between noise and signal and has made a conscious decision about which one to want to follow. Delian, that decision is not without its cost. There are quiet weekends. There are moments when something makes you laugh and there is no one nearby to share it with. There are days when the silence feels heavier than usual, when peace leans into something more reflective, and you sit with that weight honestly. You do not pretend it is something else, but you also do not let it define the entire experience. Because the full picture is larger than those moments. It includes the depth of the connections you do have, the ones where you do not have to explain yourself, where you can speak openly without monitoring the other person's reaction, where silence feels natural and honesty feels safe, and where you leave feeling more like yourself than when you arrived. Booleans, even one connection like that holds more value than you have likely been led to believe. By most social standards, you are expected to want more contacts, more plans, more people who recognize your name. But those standards are flawed. They focus on quantity when the only thing that truly sustains a person is quality. And the level of quality an empath seeks is so rare that finding even one person who can meet you there is not a consolation, it is an achievement. Man, there is a kind of strength that does not draw attention to itself. It does not fill a room or attract a crowd. It is not reflected in the size of your social circle or the number of invitations you receive. It is quieter, more internal, and far more enduring. It is built over time in private through repeated choices, choosing honesty over performance, depth over surface, solitude over the wrong kind of company. It is the strength of someone who has learned, often through difficult experience, exactly who they are, what they need, and what they will no longer compromise just to make others comfortable. Judged from the outside, that strength is often misunderstood. It can look like isolation, like difficulty, like someone who could not make social life work and eventually withdrew. But that interpretation is not just inaccurate, it reverses the truth. What has actually happened is something many people spend their entire lives avoiding. The empath with few friends has learned to sit with themselves honestly. Not the polished version, not the version designed for approval, but the complete, unfiltered self with all its complexity, sensitivity, intensity, and needs that do not always align with what the world expects. And instead of turning away from that, instead of immediately seeking distraction or external validation to soften the discomfort of self-awareness, they stayed. They learned to be present with themselves. And if you look at it clearly, that is one of the rarest forms of courage a person can have. Most people are uneasy with their own inner world, even if they never say it out loud. You can see it in how quickly silence gets filled, how often distraction is reached for, how much identity is shaped by external feedback, by how others respond, include, or validate. Many people build their sense of self around the social environment, which means when that environment shifts, they lose parts of themselves they did not realize were dependent on it. A median, the empath with a small circle, is different in this regard, not because they do not feel loneliness, and not because they do not desire connection. They often feel both very deeply, but because they have been developing something internally that many people never fully build, a stable, honest relationship with themselves that does not rely on outside validation to exist. They know what they think without needing agreement. They understand what they feel without needing it reflected back. They recognize what matters to them, what they cannot compromise, what energizes them, and what quietly drains them, not because they were told, but because they have had enough stillness to listen. And that kind of self-awareness is a form of richness that does not appear in social metrics, but supports a person through experiences that popularity alone cannot. Glenn, there is something worth considering here. The most important relationship in your life is not one you find externally. It is not the ideal friendship or the rare person who finally understands you completely. Those relationships matter, and they are meaningful when they come. But the most essential relationship you will ever have is the one you build with yourself. Peace out. And the empath, with few friends, often without planning to, has invested more deeply in that relationship than most people ever do. Not through a system or deliberate strategy, but because eventually filling their life with connections that did not fit became impossible to sustain. And in creating that space, they allowed something rare to develop, a self that is genuinely known, not performed, not adjusted, not shaped to match whoever happens to be present, but understood from within by the one person who will be there through every moment of their life. That is not something small. It is something most people spend years searching for. without realizing where it actually begins. That is not some kind of fallback for someone who could not succeed socially. It is the foundation everything else has to stand on. And most people are trying to build their lives on a base they have never taken the time to truly examine. You have examined yours slowly, sometimes painfully, often in a kind of quiet the world mislabels as emptiness. But you have still examined it, and whatever complex, deeply felt truth you discovered at your core, that belongs to you in a way nothing external ever fully can. Now, this needs to move in a more honest direction, one that discussions like this often avoid. Having few friends as an empath is not purely a strength. It is not a badge of honor. It is not proof of being superior, more evolved, or somehow better at solitude. At times, it is genuinely difficult. There are real costs, and they deserve to be acknowledged without softening them. There are moments of sharp loneliness that feel very different from peaceful solitude. Moments when something meaningful happens, something joyful or something painful, and the list of people you can share it with is so short that the absence itself becomes part of the hurt. There are periods when the quiet shifts from clarity into something heavier. When you begin to question, not with self-criticism, but with honest uncertainty, whether the standards you hold for connection reflect your values or whether they have quietly become walls so well built that even the right people cannot reach you. The question deserves a sincere answer because the line between discernment and self-protection disguised as discernment is not always easy to see from within. Discernment stays open. It has clear standards, often high ones, but it remains genuinely receptive to those who meet them. It does not reject before there is evidence. It does not assume in advance that depth is too risky or that being seen is too dangerous. It does not decide that trying again is not worth it. Self-protection, when it hides behind discernment, does the opposite. And it is worth asking yourself, honestly and without judgment, which one is guiding you, not to tear down your boundaries or force yourself into connections that do not fit, but to make sure the door is truly open for the ones that might, because something important can be easy to forget in long stretches of quiet. The kind of connection you are looking for does exist. It is not imagined. It is not something you created to make sense of what you have not yet found. There are others who operate at that same depth, people who feel the same imbalance in surface-level relationships, who value honesty over performance, who seek something real in the same way you do. They are rare, yes. You will not encounter them everywhere or at every stage of life, but they are real. And the version of you that has spent time in solitude, learning yourself, refusing to pretend, staying honest even without external validation, is exactly the version capable of recognizing them when they appear. Because you know what authenticity feels like. You have held on to that awareness, and that matters more than you may realize. Okay, so this does not end with a neat conclusion, because real things rarely do, but it does leave you with something worth holding on to, a different way of seeing it. The small circle is not a symptom, the quiet is not a flaw, the selectiveness is not a design error. And they are signs of something many people give up without noticing: the refusal to lose yourself in a life that does not truly fit. That refusal comes with a cost. You already know that cost. You have felt it in empty weekends, in unanswered questions, in that subtle sense that the world speaks a language almost, but not quite your own. But it has also created something meaningful, something steady, something that belongs entirely to you in a way surface-level connections never could. It has shaped a self that understands itself. And a self that understands itself is capable of finding the right people, not by lowering its standards, not by pretending depth is unnecessary, but by staying present, staying real, and trusting that what is rare is not impossible. It is simply worth waiting for. You are not broken. You are not falling behind. You are not someone who failed at a social system others seem to navigate with ease. You are someone who chose not to participate in a system that was never designed for how you experience the world. And that choice, quiet, often unnoticed, sometimes difficult, but always honest, is not something to dismiss. It is something to recognize.